All right, welcome back to QG Connect, everyone, where we engage industry leaders around their perspectives around data governance. And so we've been doing these over the last few months, and I'm really excited for our interview today. And first of all, I'd like to welcome John Adams, Data Governance and Privacy Manager at HBOMax. Welcome to QG Connect, John.
Hey, Barath. Hey, thank you. I'm excited to be here. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you for taking the time, and I'm really looking forward to a conversation today. And so, to help us get started, maybe we could start by, for those of us who don't quite know what HBO Max is, which I'm sure is a very tiny minority, could you maybe talk us through that, John? Talk about a little bit about what HBO Max does.
Yeah, absolutely. So HBO has been around for a while. It's got a strong brand. It used to be a standalone company that started in New York City and eventually grew into a big strong brand globally. It was bought by the Warner Media brand of companies, so it fits under the Warner Media umbrella today. And the HBO Max offering is the direct consumer offering for all of the HBO content and also Warner Media content as well. So you could say that it's Warner Media's dog in the fight for the streaming wars. And so yes, and we started back in April of 2020, and so we're still actually a new company, relatively speaking. And so it's been a lot of fun joining and working with a huge team of a lot of folks from all over a lot of different companies as well.
Yeah, from everything I've been reading, John, I think you guys are doing really great, and the subscriber growth seems to be really accelerating over the last couple of quarters. So yeah. I think that's a great sign. And I know this question has been on top of my mind, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners too. So before we get into data governance, when is House of the Dragon releasing?
Yeah. Well, let me think. I wonder, I probably should look at my employment contract and see if I'm allowed to talk about that one. No, actually, I can't say until that it's publicly released. But we know inside, and maybe you could ask one of my colleagues, and they'll let you know. As a data governance person, right, I have to protect the secret information.
No, I completely hear you. I know I've been sort of an avid follower. I've read all of the books and I've kept up with the series. So I'm really looking forward to that prequel when it does come out.
I bet. Yeah, no, it's hugely anticipated. We're lucky enough at HBO Max to have a whole, part of the business focused on content. And I think that we have the best content. I'm biased, right? But I think HBO has the best content. And of course, Game of Thrones, is just infamous. And so, yeah, we're all super excited for that to come out. And, by that time, we'll be in a number of different new territories that we're not currently in as well. And so hopefully we'll come out with a bang with that one.
Excellent. No, I'm really looking forward to understanding how, especially from a content perspective and from these business initiatives perspective, how data governance sort of plugs in. But before we get there, I was wondering maybe if you could give our listeners a little bit of about what you're interested in outside of work, what your hobbies are, just to get to know you a little bit.
Oh, thank you. No, I appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll say that I grew up in Florida, southwest Florida, Naples. So I really love the beach. I've kind of been spoiled my whole life with just growing up by the beach. I live in New York City now with my wife. And so from time to time, I like to get down to the beach and hang out by the water, do some kayaking and boating. And in Naples, growing up, my mom had a restaurant. And so the first place I ever worked was at the restaurant, back in the back, washing dishes and working in the kitchen. And I learned to cook a little bit there. And so I like to cook as well at home. I don't like to cook for 150 people. I do like to cook for my wife and friends. So I usually, after work, spend my kind of unwinding time making dinner.
No, that's great to hear. Yeah, and I think, like you pointed out, there's a lot of nuances between like making smaller meals and making meals for like you said, hundreds of people. So
Yes.
that's great to understand. And thanks for sharing that, John. Appreciate it. And now to maybe get to what you do at HBO Max, I was wondering whether you could maybe shed some light there about what your day-to-day looks like, what your responsibilities are.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you mentioned that I'm the manager of data governance and privacy for HBOMax. I think it's worth mentioning that um, the relationship that HBOMax has with Warner Media. So Warner Media is, I would say, a parent company for HBOMax. Warner Media owns a number of brands, so CNN and TBS, or some of the other ones, Adult Swim, Cartoon Network, DC, are some of the other brands. And so you can kind of think about the day-to-day as a lot of interactions within HBOMax teams, and then also a lot of interactions within the Warner Media teams. And as a data governance person, I have to work across a number of different verticals. As many of the listeners of this show, if they're part of data governance, as um, we have a highly people-centric job. In fact, I would argue that it's maybe 51% people, and then process and technology on the other 49%. And so I enjoy that in terms of the day to day. The kind of construct that we have at HBOMax is there's a governance team and a privacy team at the Warner Media level, and they kind of create the corporate infrastructure that all the brands plug into. And so HBOMax is probably considered that the largest brand that has the most first party data that we're collecting from consumers. And so we probably take a lot of the priority that the Warner Media teams focus on. And we also have a lot of data that we source directly into our HBOMax systems. And so we have a number of kind of business as usual governance processes and privacy processes within HBOMax. And then we have a number of touch points connecting up to the privacy and governance infrastructure at the Warner Media level as well. It's worth mentioning that the way that we kind of formed our data architecture is that there, and all of the folks listening are probably aware that there's a number of teams involved with that kind of value chain of data. And so a large, I would say most of the teams that are upstream of HBOMax are not within the same reporting channels. And so we have to work very closely to build relationships with those groups in order to make sure that the right priorities are aligned. So, kind of coming back to the people side of things, it's the majority of my day-to-day is focused on relationship building and gaining visibility of kind of everything that we're doing across the data lineage. And we could double click on that however you like, Barath. We can talk about specifics as we kind of move through the questions.
Absolutely, John. I mean, that's a great point. And I think that's a common theme that we've heard from the other leaders we've been interviewing in terms of how that people aspect out of those three pillars that you mentioned, that plays the most critical role among all of the different things you have to consider. And I think especially in this age when, it's a very distributed workforce. I'm sure it's the same at HBOMax, like that people, the relationship building, that those people kind of getting to know you. I think that becomes even more critical, and it was already critical before.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we could definitely double click into that, John. But before we go there, I was wondering if you take yourself back to maybe the beginning of your career, what made you want to get into this area in the first place?
Wow, that's a excuse me, that's a great question. It's kind of funny, sometimes we just end up kind of lucky. I think, and I'm one of those people. I think I got lucky with seeing opportunities and kind of knowing when to take on work that maybe I didn't know how to do, and just kind of figured that I would figure it out as I get involved. But the story is, I studied economics in school, so it was a quantitative program, and I got out of school and I spent a year in Mexico City working in business development, so 100% on the people side. And it was kind of one of those opportunities to work in a foreign country that, excuse me, I didn't know if I'd be able to get that opportunity again. So I went down there for a year and really enjoyed it. But there came a time where I had to refocus back on kind of the long term. And so I came back to the US and started looking at like what are the highest paying jobs. I mean, it's kind of a funny story, but I went on Glassdoor.com and sorted by highest paying open roles. And it was most of them were in data. There were some, you know, medical roles as well that paid really well, but considering my education, I thought, well, maybe I could get into the data space. So I started taking Coursera classes and classes on edX, MIT open courseware type classes. So just learned kind of on my own. And I got a job at a company called DataQG Logistics, which is based here in Southwest Florida. And that job was a tough job. I didn't like it very much. It was very much a difficult kind of learning experience, but it's one of those first jobs that you have to get in order to get started. And from there, I went on to do defense contracting with the U.S. Army, which was a lot of fun. I was a data analyst for that position, so I built reports and built insights. And then I got a call from CarMax, which is based in Richmond, Virginia, and they were looking for a governance position. And what intrigued me about that was it was an opportunity to get more exposure kind of to the end-to-end visibility of data and the data management side, which as an analyst, I was always curious about how that value chain worked. We kind of just built reports and built metrics, but you know, we always had a ton of questions about like, what does this data mean? How did we get this data? Is this quality? Is this data of good quality? Those questions sometimes were really hard to answer. I noticed that it was hard to be able to identify the specific people to answer those questions. And then also when we found folks, they were often just SMEs in a small portion of the end-to-end. And so building that visibility was tough on behalf of being an analyst. And so when the governance opportunity came up, I thought, well, this is an impactful position, right? It's a position that offers a lot of value to the analyst community and can also offer a lot of value to the engineering community. And if kind of done right, as I learned, if done right, it's a huge unlock for the business as well. And so I got lucky, the opportunity came up, I took it. And over the years, I've just become more and more interested in it. Now, what's been fun is after I went to CarMax, I went to Nike. I got exposed to privacy at Nike, which has become like my favorite topic in governance since then. And I think privacy represents the biggest opportunity for governance to provide value right now for businesses. It's something that everyone's interested in talking about. Most people want to do the right thing. So sponsorship is not as difficult to gain. And also it's not really a nice to have, it's a need to have because of regulation. So I think it's something that all governance professionals should be considering learning about and introducing to their programs, if not already there. And so we can talk about that too. And now I'm at HBO doing governance and privacy, building kind of from the ground up. I mentioned HBO started in April of 2020 in the pandemic. So the whole company's been built remotely. And it's all brand new. And so there's a ton of opportunities for governance. I'm glad they called us in early. I'm glad they hired governance people relatively early because we get to build from the ground up in parallel with scaling the company globally. So that's kind of why I joined HBOMax and where I'm at now.
First of all, love that story, John. I mean, the fact that you were sort of more or less a self-taught in terms of the skills and figuring out like which areas to get into, and that research that you mentioned on Glassdoor. So first of all, I really love that story because I think it brings to life how you could sort of put together and give yourself the right opportunity, put yourself in the right place at the right time, and sort of, I think that was a great story that you shared. So thank you for that. And I mean, in terms of the privacy, the data privacy and how it fits within governance, I think that is something that we've also been hearing from a lot of the leaders that we've been talking to. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about, so if you take a step back and try to think about what data governance is, how would you
Yeah.
frame it in your own mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is a common question, and it's really it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of interpretations, and there's also kind of like legacy thinking, and then there's some new thinking now about what governance is. What I'll say is that you have to have a stance first of all, and so the way that I try to answer this question for folks within my business that I'm working at the time, whether it's Nike or HBO, is governance is kind of like, well, data is kind of like basketball, right? So data in general is, you can kind of make a basketball analogy. So if you've got your players catching the ball off the rebound and driving the ball up the court, those are kind of like your data engineers, right? They're bringing the data closer toward the objective, which is to make the basket. And then they'll pass it to one of the shooters, right? The shooters are kind of like your data scientists, your data analysts, the folks that are creating the business value out of the data. And so when they shoot and make a basket, that's like realizing some business value. Now, the interesting thing about basketball is they're playing on a court, and they're playing within a set of rules. And there's referees that are keeping an eye to make sure the players are abiding by the rules. So governance is kind of like the court and the referees in that analogy. Now, the difference between like referees and governance people, and this is kind of my take on governance, is we don't go and blow the whistle and stop the game. We kind of position ourselves as a resource where that if a couple of players have a conflict or have a foul, they can turn to us and say, hey, what's the right decision, right? And we're kind of that third party that can provide the guidance on where to move next. And so that's kind of the difference between us and referees. Because if you try to position yourself as a referee, oftentimes you'll just be left out of conversations, which goes back to that relationship building side.
No, I love that. And yeah, I have a son who plays, in a basketball league. And it's funny, I keep telling him, don't wait for the referee to call a foul. Like if someone falls, you just play through it. So anyway, he and I like get into these discussions about basketball. So your analogy really resonated with me. And one thing I'd also love to get your take on is if you take a look at what's driving organizations like HBOMax to think about data governance in the first place, what would some of those drivers be within the media space?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's worth mentioning that I like the way you phrase the question within the media space, which is kind of unique to retail or e-commerce or banking, for example. What I would say is within media, I think the biggest things that we are focused on at HBOMax come down to data literacy right now, and also lineage and visibility of kind of all of our systems, and also privacy. So within the literacy bucket, this is kind of a term that I've heard bouncing around over the last couple of years. It wasn't a popular term 5 years ago. Now it seems to be a popular one, and I think that's where that people are starting to kind of try to associate the glossaries and dictionaries and data governance tools and stewardship to realizing a business outcome, which is that the business becomes more data driven. Stakeholders are more kind of literate, for lack of a better word, literate about what the data mean, how to leverage it in their decision making, how to use tools, also how to use Tableau, how to use Looker, and also educating stakeholders more on the business side, like what are the right questions to ask and how, and positioning them and setting them up for success to be able to use data to answer those questions. So that's a huge area for HBOMax. I think that the context for that is that we're rolling out to new regions every quarter, every 6 months. And so we're introducing new reports, new data, new insights to existing employees in those regions. And so we have to kind of catch them up on, the way that we're structuring all of the KPIs and data science models and these types of things. And so the tools we use are glossaries and dictionaries and lineage documentation for that. I also mentioned privacy. So within media, the media business in general, something that's kind of interesting is media companies use a lot of information about consumers to understand their audiences. And so this was a unique change for me, kind of learning how that the business leverages more demographic data about consumers. For example, at Nike and at CarMax, those are both considered retail and e-commerce companies. Their kind of third-party demographic data analysis of their consumers was not as deeply researched as at Warner Media. In fact, most of the research was just on analyzing consumer behavior within the experiences, the different ways that consumers are interacting with the brand online, and traversing through the kind of buy funnel, so to speak. Whereas with media, third-party demographic data is huge. And that's where privacy kind of starts to become a lot more important, because you have to create really it's two things. You have to create you have to disclose exactly what we're doing with consumers' data, and you have to offer control to the consumer, controls that they can leverage independently to make sure that HBOMax and other Warner Media brands are processing their data to their preferences. So those controls are a lot more important, I think, because that we have so much more data about consumers.
Yeah, that's great insight. And I was curious. I mean, in terms of all of these drivers that you mentioned, both external and internal, like you pointed out, how has maybe COVID impacted these drivers? Has it maybe accelerated some of these trends that you just talked through?
Oh yes, this is a great question. You got a lot of good questions. So COVID-19, as tragic and as much of a negative impact it's had on the world, it has benefited companies that are data driven. And I say that because there's still a large number of folks in the economy that are continuing to purchase at the same rate or even higher than pre-pandemic. And so however, the methods of doing that has changed. Everything's shifted to online. And so companies that have an online presence and are data-driven are having a much more intimate, I think, relationship with consumers on a one-to-one level than before. We are collecting a lot of information about every user's interaction with our experience. And this is not just HBOMax, this is every company that's selling online, every direct-to-consumer business. And so what I would say is that COVID-19 accelerated the movement towards direct-to-consumer. There was already a lot of anticipation that direct-to-consumer would dominate basically every business model pre-pandemic, but the pandemic accelerated that as folks were basically forced to adopt direct consumer offerings. And so being on the kind of, I would say, folks in data, folks in technology, we've been extremely lucky to be on this side of the pandemic, which is that we're benefiting, in a sense, our careers are benefiting from it because that we are so busy trying to create these solutions for companies. Every time that you shop online, there's a huge team of people on the other side of that experience. And so, excuse me, I would say that, it accelerated direct consumer, and it's given folks in the data community a lot of opportunities. One thing I'll say is, if you're a viewer that is considering going into governance or considering going into any data job, there's no better time than right now. I think that being someone that I'm looking for talent, I'm also hiring consultants. It's very hard to find talent right now globally. There's a global shortage, and so it's a great time to get in the industry. And it's also a great time if you're already in the profession and you're thinking about taking on a different role, or if you're thinking about switching companies, or if you've been at a company for a long time and you want to get exposed to something else. Again, now is a really good time. The market is very hot for your skill set. And so just from my vantage point, I think that we've been on the kind of benefiting side of the pandemic, fortunately.
No, that's a great point, John. I mean, yeah, in terms of the not COVID, not just accelerating these drivers, but from the talent perspective, like you pointed out, it's a really sort of an ideal market, more or less, for
Yes.
individuals who are looking to maybe progress within their careers or maybe look to a new career. And I'd love your sort of shout out to how like organizations are thinking about data governance more than they were. So it's a perfect time, like you said, to get into this area. And I mean, yeah, this takes me to another question, John. Like we've talked about your sort of your background, what HBOMax does, how data governance fits in. But I was wondering, like, if you want to talk about like guided steps, let's say, for a successful program to get it off of the ground, are there any sort of steps that you can think of that would sort of allow anyone to sort of put a plan together and start executing, like when they start to build a new program?
It's a great question, I think, and it's also a very I think it's a frequent question that comes up because so many companies are introducing governance. Governance usually comes after an analytics program starts, so that's something to keep in mind, is that if you're someone in a position that is thinking through how to start a governance program, or how to just, even if you're not a governance person, maybe you're an analyst, or maybe you're a data leader within a company. As you think about governance, you want to focus first on the whys, right? So why governance? Why is this important? I think that it always kind of stems from a executive understanding that there's a need for governance. And so the best way to start from zero is you want to define what governance will mean for the business. And then you want to tell the story of why that's important for the company. And then you got to bring it at the executive level first. And the reason I say executive level is because it's going to eventually, data governance processes require collaboration across a lot of different teams. And so to have the buy-in from a number of teams to collaborate on one initiative or a couple of initiatives, it requires all those teams to be aligned to some sort of priority from the executive level. It just makes the conversation a lot easier with those teams to prioritize the work. And so as you're thinking about the strategy, some of the whys that are impactful need to be coming from kind of the issues that you're seeing within your data community. The best way to kind of frame governance as a value offering is that it will alleviate issues in the short term, like the 1 year time frame. And so you could be looking for data quality challenges. You could be looking for a lack of sources of truth. The whole conversation around, there might, especially if you're in retail, a company that has kind of transformed from a brick and mortar business to a omni-channel business, you can see a lot of examples where there's multiple sources of the same data. And so if you're in that line of business, governance can help try to unify the architecture down to a source of truth. You could also be looking for just really kind of fragmented reporting and fragmented data-driven decision making. And that ties into the literacy side of things, where that usually when you have pockets of the business that are using different reports and data to make decisions, it means that there's only certain groups that know how to do that. And so governance can help educate other parts of the business for how to leverage data as well. Basically, the idea is that they can create more demand for data through literacy programs. And so let me think what else. another thing that you might notice is that you might see teams kind of going back and forth about what are the definitions of these terms, what are the definitions of this data. That's another thing that governance can really help out with. It kind of depends. I would say that it's one of the phase 2 things to focus on. You want to focus on the more critical issues that are preventing the business from moving forward first, and then definitional work. People can still operate if there's misaligned definitions, and so you could probably want to make that as a phase 2. And finally, the last thing that I'll say is that if you see problems with changes happening upstream, right, in the data lineage that are impacting downstream systems, and folks are kind of just finding out about it through issues, that's another area governance can help bring together teams to make sure that there's close coordination when changes are occurring within the data lineage as well.
No, yeah, that's a great point, John. And I love your point around maybe breaking it up into phases, because on the one hand, business is trying to move fast, so you have to show quick results. So what are some of the projects that you can focus on which show the highest impact? So that would be, I love your point around putting that maybe in phase 1, and then talking about one of these other initiatives into phase 2, which are still critical, but maybe not as time sensitive as the first phase, because that's one thing we've heard from other leaders as well. Because earlier, I mean, governance programs could take easily up to a year to show value, but due to COVID and all the things we talked about, businesses are sort of looking for a quicker ROI, if you will, when it comes to those kind of programs.
It's true, and I left out privacy. You know, I think that privacy is, especially if your company is dealing with a lot of personal data, and if you're operating in California, Virginia, Colorado, and the United States, if you're operating in Europe, or if you're operating in Brazil, you have compliance obligations if you're collecting personal data within those markets. And so privacy, though, is kind of a unique skill set, is one thing I'll say. If you're trying to start a governance program and you see that privacy use cases are within scope for your company, it's probably best to start with hiring an expert consultant that can really articulate the specific privacy needs of the business. If you don't have experience with privacy yourself, and the reason I say that is that it's a very nuanced skill set that has a lot of legal implications, and so if you don't have exposure to it, the best thing to start with is bringing in some experts to build the whys with you. But I would also suggest that you do take a look at privacy, because it gives you a lot of tailwinds with leadership for your program. Leadership is very easily bought into privacy, is what I've seen. People like to talk about it, and so just keep that in mind as well.
That's a great point. And I think, I mean, this. Do you think that these other drivers in terms of like the move to the cloud, like these multi-cloud, hybrid cloud environments, and how it sort of how data sort of spread across these different environments, and do you think that is another factor that's maybe leading organizations to think about data privacy and take it more seriously?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So multi-cloud strategies are working backwards from the idea that certain use cases are better productionized out of different types of cloud environments. So the idea is that there is a legitimate technological need to create different cloud platforms based on the different use cases that are coming online. So an example, you wouldn't want to necessarily productionize a experience personalization algorithm in the same database that you productionize all of your critical reporting. There's different technology involved with those two use cases. And so that's kind of the impetus for why that you have these multi-cloud solutions. And so I'm a proponent, first of all, I'll just say, like, I think multi-cloud is the direction to go. From a cost standpoint, it's better. From a performance standpoint, it's better. Now, where it gets hard is from a governance, privacy, and talent standpoint. So talent, actually, let me take talent first. As you introduce more tools into your stack, uh, it's hard to find individuals that have exposure to all these tools. And so when you bring in a multi-cloud strategy, just expect for some of your headcount to have to either educate themselves and learn, expect to fund some of that learning, and also expect to pay more when you're looking out in the market for folks that know how to use those environments. And the same thing is true with governance people. Finding the governance people that have been exposed to those tools is difficult. And so from a governance standpoint, kind of as a second difficulty, it makes it a lot harder to do governance with multiple environments, whether they're multiple clouds or just a lot of systems within the data lineage. It's more places to have to maintain visibility, right? And so what I'll say is that the imperative on governance to maintain that visibility becomes more increased. And so I think that it's another tailwind, to be honest. I think it's, technology leaders and have a hard time maintaining the visibility across all those systems. And that's where governance can help. Now, another thing is that as you think about your multi-cloud strategy and as you think about governance and privacy with those tools, you need to be thinking about it from the standpoint of working backwards from the use cases, prioritize the most important use cases first, and then create your policies and procedures and business as usual processes to impact the high value use cases and design the policies to work for those tools. So you might have different policies sometimes for different tools, depending on what the business is doing with those.
Yeah, that's great insight, John. And one other point I'd love to get your perspective on is around the KPIs that you mentioned in just a few minutes back. So in your mind, maybe could you talk through what some of those KPIs need to be that a data governance team can take ownership of?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing I'll say is that this question comes up often, and so it's important to try to be ready for it. With our governance team, what we're mainly focused on is 3 areas to start. Security, access, privacy is kind of one area, and then literacy and data governance kind of leadership are the other 2. So some of the KPIs that fit within those, I'll take literacy first. I'm one of the folks that I think that we should be democratizing access to our data and democratizing data literacy across the organization as much as we can. And so one KPI could be the number of users of Tableau across the organization. I think that's a direct function of how well are we trained in the business and kind of influencing the business to adopt data into their process. And I think governance can have a huge impact on that number. Another kind of KPI that I think is important on the security and access side is like percent of your data systems that have a data classification structure, or percent of your data that is classified within the data classification framework for your organization. If you're not familiar with data classification, it's basically just organizing your data into sensitivity groups. So you might have, for us, we have a simple one. It's restricted, sensitive, and general. And then from there, we have subcategories within each of those. So like, for example, within the restricted data classification, there's SPI, sensitive personal information. And so all of the columns that we have within our environments that are PII get a metadata tag with the restricted data tier so that we can closely manage that data. So a percentage of the databases that have data classification mappings, it's another good KPI from a security standpoint. And then privacy, I think a great KPI, simple one, is the amount of time it takes to process DSARs or some companies call them IRR. So DSAR stands for Data Subject Rights Request. IRR stands for Individual Rights Request. The idea is that if a consumer asks for your business to delete their data or to share back the data that you have about them, a KPI is how quickly were you able to get that request fulfilled? Was it within SLA? Was it within the compliance SLA? That's another good one. And then finally, another one that just came to mind is percent of systems that have gone through a privacy impact assessment. So every company should have a standard process for assessing whether or not certain systems are within scope for privacy controls. So privacy impact assessments are the tool and process that you use to gather that information. And so if you can get a percentage of how many of your systems have gone through that process, that's another good KPI.
Yeah, I feel there's a lot to unpack there, John. And I feel like if we start doing that, it'll take us down a rabbit hole. But no, that's sort of a great overview of the different KPIs and that you can start tracking. And I think, like you pointed out multiple times, like data privacy is an important element within data governance. And so you really need to be thinking about that when you are thinking about how to measure success. Yeah, I mean, I know there's a bunch of questions I want to ask John, but I think we are running out of time. So in just a couple of questions left, I mean, one was, where do you see this market going in the next few years? Like in terms of maybe like if you take a look at like 3 to 5 years, where do you see data governance emerging afterwards?
That's a good question. Well, one thing I can say is the overall kind of need for data is set to grow by huge growth rates over the next 10 years. And so governance is kind of, I would say, a function of that, right? Governance is a function of how much the need for data increases within companies. And just to give some specifics, the numbers that I've seen around privacy and governance, the privacy and governance market, it right now I think is around 1.7 billion globally. I think that includes like consulting, training, and tools. That's set to grow to over about almost 6 billion in the next 5 years. So it's going to increase sixfold in the next 5 years. Now that number, that sixfold number, is actually quite small compared to the size of growth that's going to be experienced within the data science and kind of AI ML world. I think the market growth in that world is over 10x in the next 5 years. And so like in relation to kind of the data industry overall, I think governance will grow a little bit at a little slower pace than the rest of the industry, but it's still huge growth by any means compared to a lot of other industries and a lot of other careers. And actually, I like it because it's a little bit more niche in that there's not as much competition. That's something to keep in mind too, is that if you're trying to make a decision between going into governance and privacy versus perhaps data science or data engineering, just think about that, governance and privacy, you'll experience a lot less competition. And there's going to be a lot more people working within the data science, and also, data product management's another new one too. So keep that in mind. And one thing I'll say is that, again, I'll just say that privacy is a need to have, not a nice to have. And so there's job security there. The privacy market is going to grow probably more than the governance market, just because of all of the new introductions of privacy regulations and the complexity involved with them. And so keep that in mind as well.
And my last question, John, for us today is, where do you think resources, frameworks sort of fit within those the data governance programs that we were talking about? And my sort of the related question is, what did you hope to gain maybe by leveraging a resource platform like DataQG? I was wondering if you could share your thoughts there.
Well, I think DataQG is really addressing a big problem, first of all, I'll say. And the problem is that there's not a lot of resources for governance folks, and there's not a lot of recent approaches or recent knowledge that is easily available. There's, the data management body of knowledge. That book has been around for a long time. I'm one of the folks, maybe I might ruffle some feathers, especially in the financial services world. I'll ruffle some feathers and say that I think the data management body of knowledge is going to be outdated, if not already. And the reason for that is, companies are operating different. We have product teams that are agile. Governance needs to become more agile. And so I think DataQG will expose a lot of those kind of gaps that, exist in the current body of knowledge that we have. I think DataQG will offer the new body of knowledge. And it'll give us an opportunity to really kind of take a pulse on what are governance practitioners doing now in market at their business, and how is that different across different industries, and how can we adopt different practices from different industries. And so I'm excited. I think this engagement's great. I was very thankful that you wanted to do this interview, and so I really appreciate it, Barath, and Phil as well. Phil is a great guy. We met a couple weeks ago, and so yeah, I'm excited for kind of what's to come with DataQG, and always here to help support and provide input to your community.
No, thanks a lot, John, for being such a strong proponent. I think that was one of the first things. Like when we first met, we walked away with really sort of happy that you saw so much value in this initiative that we put together, and looking forward to continuing to partner with you on our journey there.
Likewise, no, it's going to be fun. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, John. And one last question: like, where could our listeners and viewers find you? LinkedIn, Twitter? Wondering if you could share details there.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, I forgot to mention that. So you can find me on LinkedIn under John N. Adams. And my email address that you can reach me at is johnadamsdata@gmail.com. And yeah, feel free to reach out anytime. I love to make new connections and talk about data and data governance.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, John, again, for taking the time, and really enjoyed our conversation today. I just wanted to say that.
Me too. Really appreciate it, bro.
Thanks so much.